Hi, Tim. Thanks for joining me today. I first want us to introduce ourselves. I am Reverend Breanna Illéné, and I am at the Wisconsin Council of Churches, the Director of Ecumenical Innovation and Justice Initiatives. And you?
I'm Reverend Tim Schaefer, pastor at First Baptist Church in Madison.
Awesome. So last night, you and I hung out. We hang out a lot, but we hung out in a particular spot together. We attended the East Side Community Conversations about the Common Council budget.
That's right.
I think that was what it was titled. But it was a conversation about what is happening with the city budget in Madison. We gathered with a bunch of other community members at a local elementary school to talk about the budget. Can you share a little bit about why there are these conversations about the city budget happening?
Yeah, so this is the latest step in something we've been working on for a little while with some other partners, in collaboration with some other partners. And so essentially the city of Madison will face a $27 million structural budget deficit in its 2025 city budget, operating budget. And this is much larger than previous budget deficits. So, the sort of previous strategies of just shaving a % off of expenditures here or supplementing with some extra pockets of money there it's not going to be sustainable. And that deficit in future years will also grow. And so the city is really wrestling with how do they bring their revenue and their expenditures in line. And this has to be sort of a long-term discussion because it will keep snowballing if nothing is done. And so the city decided, which I think was really wise, to engage the community and hear from the community and what they value in terms of like services that they get and things like that. And like what could we maybe let go of and what do we feel is really important that we can't let go of? And that was the purpose of those conversations yesterday, and that was the first of 5 that are going to be happening throughout different regions of the city.
And we've been, as you mentioned, we've kind of have been working on this with a group of with clergy and nonprofit leaders, talking about the city budget. We went to the last Common Council meeting and spoke as a group about the impacts of the budget, because the reality is budget cuts would impact marginalized communities. Right. They would impact nonprofits. They would impact poor people, and even the idea of adding in fees would also impact people disproportionately. And so we gathered and spoke in favor of passing a referendum. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of the first move. And then showing up at this community meeting was the second move. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what happened at what the meeting looked like? What did we do?
Yeah, so the first thing that I really appreciated, although we had done our homework and we had watched some videos that the city put out about the budget, kind of explaining it, I thought what was really helpful was just that level setting at the beginning, where the finance director for the city came in and did a presentation. And then answered questions. That was kind of the first step, so that we all had a basic understanding of what the problem was and where we're at. And I actually found that to be incredibly helpful, because even though we had done a lot of research on this already, there were some things that came up that I didn't know. And the one thing I will say about a city budget is, we as pastors at least all deal with church budgets, organizational budgets. The city budget is just something else altogether, so super complicated. And there are so many different state laws about how the city can raise revenue or not, mostly not, or how certain pockets of money can be spent, right? There's a lot of limitations that the state legislature has put on cities. And so that was really helpful. But then the next phase of that, after we had got this kind of level setting, was to engage in some conversations about values, really. What do we place value on? What would we be willing to sort of let go? What do we want to tell alders that might be okay to cut here, or it might not be okay to cut here? And that was really fascinating in small groups at tables, because you just heard really a variety of folks that had an opportunity, and they had personal stories of how these services would impact them personally, and that was really powerful.
Yeah, I found my table was really interesting because people were willing to grapple with it. It wasn't just, well, cut this thing. We had a lot of, okay, so if we cut this thing, what are the implications? What happens then? What's the long-term effects? And I found that refreshing because so often conversation, like when it happens online or even in emails, it's kind of this one way, or it might be a back and forth, but it's a very slow back and forth. And it doesn't get you that space to kind of wrestle and think bigger picture. So that was one of the really cool things I appreciated, and just bringing together lots of people around a really complex problem. Mm-hmm. So you had a story about when you saw God show up in this process. Mm-hmm. Can you share that?
Yeah, I tended to, in my, so this was broken up into two parts, and we had two different tables, two different groups, because there were two different sort of groupings of questions that we were asked. And in one of those groups, I tended to kind of stay back a little bit and not be the first to answer, and I wanted to hear from other people. And somebody prompted me to answer the question about, what I place value in. And I talked a little bit about my perspective as a pastor, and I wasn't just speaking for myself personally, but also for my congregants and for my community. And talked a little bit about how our values and what we value really come from our faith values, and made that connection. And then that turned into a conversation afterwards for a little while with one person who was really curious about that, who was like, so tell me a little bit more about your church. Tell me a little bit more about these values that you mentioned. I'm really surprised to see a faith leader here speaking up on behalf of these services and marginalized people and equity and things like that. And so there was this interesting connection of somebody who didn't seem to have grown up in the church, but just being really kind of curious about our motivation for being there. And not in a bad way. Sometimes I think that curiosity is sort of not a positive thing. In this case, it was very much a positive thing, because she felt that the values I was expressing really resonated with her own personal values. And mine were rooted in my faith, and hers may have been rooted in something slightly different. And it was interesting to talk through that similarity.
Yeah. I experienced something a little similar with a city staff person who, as I started talking, all of a sudden went, oh, I recognize you from showing up at the Common Council meeting. Yeah. That's why you looked familiar. Yeah. And then said, it was really interesting to see the church there. Mm-hmm. We often don't see that. And I've not seen the church stand up in this way. It's always been a much more kind of confrontational. We are mad about something. We are fighting against something. But in this, like, hey, we want to speak up for marginalized communities, was a different shift that they had, according to them, hadn't experienced before. Yeah. So we've kind of started on that. Why is it important for the church to be showing up at these sort of things?
Yeah, that experience that I had definitely prompted me to think about that a little bit. And I think what's interesting is we get so caught up in the activities within our own walls, and I think we sometimes forget, although we talk about it, we forget that we also exist to serve a community. And I was just thinking a little bit about the ministry of Jesus. Jesus taught in the synagogue, right? But that happened infrequently. Like, most of the time Jesus was going out to surrounding towns and villages and meeting people where they were, and connecting with them and with their experiences, and it wasn't always the powerful, the elite, right, that could travel to see him. It was common folks, and so I think part of what that teaches us, this experience, is that we have to meet people where they are, and we have to try to seek that equity, right? Like the people who have the time at specific meeting that's scheduled, and the people that can travel across the city, take time off work. They most likely have the resources to be able to do that. They may not have kids, and as right, like I can imagine a single parent, let's say, with young kids just saying, I'm not going to be able to make this meeting. What I loved was that was really an accommodation that was made at that meeting. There was a special kids table, and there were folks there, volunteers there to help keep them occupied. And there were translator tables for different languages. There was food available, right? So like what a cool experience to just overcome some of those reasons why people might not come and participate. But also the fact that these meetings are happening, this is the first of 5, happening in different parts of the city. Like this is the city actually getting out of its building and going to the communities, right? And like we don't often do the same thing, but that is, I think, a model that we should be following.
Yeah, and I just think about the impact of the church being in the community.
Yeah.
The church having a space. And sometimes that might be like, I was wearing my collar, and so it was very, Tim had his name tag on. We were very visible representatives of the church. But sometimes it might be that really, you might not use that faith language, but you're still there because our faith calls us to speak up for the marginalized and to work for the flourishing of our communities. And sometimes those are voices that say, well, of course we all want a flourishing community, so I'm not going to show up at the meeting. And then it's people often who just are mad about something and are maybe wanting to tear something down. And there is that right, but we need all those voices at the table. And I think it's really important, like people of faith, we often represent this wide breadth of people. How do we help build that more diverse voice, that stronger voice calling to values, calling to community, calling to flourishing, I think is so important.
Yeah, it was interesting to me, like a lot of what was talked about yesterday, like I said, that explicit language of loving your neighbor wasn't necessarily spoken, but that was what I experienced, right?
Yes.
And we're there, I think also from our own, faith values to talk about how do we show love for our neighbors, how do we support our communities, and how do we make our cities thrive, like you said. And I think that's so important because you probably would agree, but I didn't feel like my role or our role was there to do sort of what we would typically think of as evagelism, right? To necessarily talk about the church or promote the church or get people to come and visit our churches or anything like that, right? It was to spread the good news, and to me what that really means is just seeking wholeness and healing, like for those especially who need it in our communities.
So there are 4 more of these, and some other opportunities. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, right now it seems that there are 4 other sort of regional meetings that are scheduled. The west side, the north side, the south and near west side will have one combined. The nice thing about these is if the one in your area, if you can't make it to that, it is fairly open. In fact, there were non-East Siders at the East Side one yesterday. We let the West Siders in. that turned into some rivalry there. I think in the meeting it sounded like, but fun, but in a fun way. And so I think for us as clergy, we want to promote this as widely as possible, because it's not just clergy that need to go; it's our congregants that need to go. And I think especially we need to share these opportunities with those folks who are going to be the most impacted by things like budget cuts. So those who rely the most heavily potentially on city services, really should have their voices heard, and we want to make sure that we have sort of this representation of all sorts of folks, a diverse community of folks at these meetings. So if you can't make one in your neighborhood, go to one of the others. That's absolutely okay. The city encourages it, in fact. Go to multiple meetings if you want to. I think that's okay as well. What I just loved was the big sheets of paper and everybody's thoughts got put on there, and that's going to get taken back to city staff so that they can sort through and see what people are saying. But I love, as you mentioned, an email is so one-sided sometimes, and I know all of our alders are getting lots of emails about, cut this, cut this, cut this. It's really nice. This different model is nice because those who may have that kind of an approach also hear from someone else who has a very different opinion in that same discussion group, and that gets connected with someone's personal story. And I think that is doing that together and seeing that, wow, you know what, they're coming from a different place, don't have the same experiences as me, and they actually are saying something very different. It's really good for people to see that and hear that and know that, man, I'm like in this bubble, and I just thought everybody thought like me, right? And that's not the case. And I thought that was also really eye-opening and really important. So you only get that if you get a good cross-section and good sort of diversity, good representation at these meetings. So I think we need to do our best to just promote it and get as many people involved in this process as possible.
Awesome. So get out and engage.
Yeah.
just like Jesus.
That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.